Martin Dugard, welcome back to my show. I had you on, it's got to be about a year ago now, when we were talking about your brilliant Taking Paris. And we're going to talk in a moment about your latest book, Taking Berlin. It's the second in your World War II series. And it's sort of the pace of writing and the narrative and the style, the format, I guess, imitates on some level the Killing series, which you've done with Bill O'Reilly for so many years and had enormous success with it. But I kind of want to start somewhere else. I just want to sort of get your backstory, as it were. And through our conversations and my own research and just learning more about you, I'm sort of amazed and dumbfounded on some levels, just about your overall character, your energy, your passion, your life as an American, as a dad, and in your community, because you've this big passion for track and field, and some of your writings took you in that direction. So you have this just amazing success and extraordinary energy. And on some levels, you know, you're a celebrity in your own right. And yet you strike me as being this humble individual who doesn't really seek out the limelight. And you have your feet planted in your community. I guess it's in Southern California. So I'm impressed. So just a little bit about yourself. How did you come to be Martin Dugard, this successful writer?
It all happened when I first got out of college, and I got a really crappy corporate job, and I would come home every day and tell my wife how much I hated my job. I was working as was it procurement? I was working in a cubicle for some really big company, and my wife told me to, if I didn't like it, to do something different. So I began writing on the side, very small articles for running and triathlon magazines. Those led to bigger freelance articles, Sports Illustrated, Esquire, GQ. And at some point I had to choose between the corporate world and the writing world. And so, I chose writing. And it's been, I left the corporate world in 1994, and actually February 24th, 1994, not that I remember the date. And it was a watershed moment in my life. But at the time, my wife told me, if I was going to be a full-time writer, I had to be all in. I wasn't, she said, "Don't I want to see you reading want ads. I don't want to see you talking about some other career. If you want to make it as a writer, make it as a writer." And, it's, peaks and valleys, so it's a very, very, you got to hustle type profession. And I, as my kids got older, I've got three sons. As they get older, the realities of traveling 3 months out of the year to do magazine articles wasn't as appealing. So I made the leap into books, and that was 1997, 1998, and then I did a number of books, and then I began writing the Killing series with Bill back in about 2009, and somewhere along the line I wanted to get back to doing what I do, and I had some fun stuff before the Bill stuff. I covered the Tour de France for 10 years. I wrote books about several great historical figures that took me around the world, but this Taking series, Taking Paris, Taking Berlin, and the upcoming Taking London, which I'm working on right now, is a fun trilogy. It's nice to be writing in my own voice again. Like you said, I my name is out there, but I really like just the solitude and the silence of sitting here in my little office writing books, and I like the quiet, and I just like to write. The marketing part of it is not my forte. So, like I said, I've got a nice little town. At the end of the day, I go over and coach cross country and track at the local high school, and it's a good life.
Yeah, and you had a success with a book, To Be a Runner. That's kind of sort of an industry standard among some groups.
Yeah. Thanks for that. That came out of I was actually working on a very unfulfilling project. I was ghostwriting a book for somebody, and I was just really bored with it. So I, to inspire myself every day, I challenged myself to write 30 essays about running in 1 month. So, one a day. Start the day with 1,500 words about running, and then when I got to the end of it, my agent and I had already had an agreement that I would never, ever, ever pitch a book about running. When I got to the end of it, I spent a couple months polishing it up. I printed the whole thing out, wrapped a red ribbon around it, and put it in a FedEx envelope and sent it to my agent and said, if you like this, let's take it out to see if we can sell it. If you don't like it, just throw it in the trash and we'll act like it never happened. So he liked it.
Wow, great. Um, just quickly, you were in the corporate world, communications.
A little bit. I would start in procurement. I
Oh,
went
you
over to
did
what is
say
called,
procurement, so that's a little bit
yeah,
different.
yeah, but I went over to what is called cost and scheduling, which is basically data entry. And then, yeah, I kind of found that like, well, I've got a college degree and I'm doing data entry on spreadsheets, all day long. And then I moved into marketing, which was nice. I got to wear a suit and, talk to the executives and be in these big meetings. But it was just never me. It wasn't
Yeah.
right. And, by the way, while I was working, I wrote at, in my corporate job. So every time I got a task finished and I had nothing else to do, I'd open up a file and write a story. So that's, I should probably pay them back all the salary I made during those years.
um, well, a lot of people in journalism, even in big jobs in journalism, um, sometimes or a lot of them make that leap over to the corporate side for more money typically. They get an offer they can't refuse, so to speak, but it's always laughingly referred to as going to the dark side, that
Yeah.
they're in the job but they're not. I mean, there are plenty of exceptions. Some people probably love corporate communications. They see it as a science, and there's certain aspects of it I presume are stimulating, but a lot of them are not happy in their hearts and soul. They want to be that writer they went to school to be, or they felt that longing for as a kid.
Yeah, no, I can understand that. I can see, I'm a freelance writer, and I've been doing this for a long time. And at the end of the day, there's still a mortgage to be paid, and there's a retirement plan to fund, and I can see why people would opt for, making a few extra bucks. Um, in in my case, I'm a little bit more introverted. Excuse me, need some more coffee. Um, but
Well, you can
also
have some from my coffee
I
shop
can
behind
see,
me
yeah,
here.
I won't make trouble. Um, but uh, I don't like the petty posturing and the politics and I don't like writing something and have a committee, have to go through it and scrutinize it and sign off on it, especially when they're not writers, and they don't really understand the process of the content. At that point, I would have been a very bad employee if I'd opted for corporate communications because, um, I'm fussy. I love the written word. I love to make paragraphs come to life. I like perfect punctuation, all those little things that writers geek out on. Um, and it would be a little bit of an affront to have somebody, take a lovely sentence that really has meaning and put some kind of corporate, maxim in there instead that really just doesn't, make your heart sore. That's kind of the purist in me.
Yeah. Well, communications has so many facets. We have the corporate communications interacting with the world of media, and the media and reporters taking those press releases and all that information from press conferences and trying to make sense of it and weigh it up. So you kind of wonder sometimes, what kind of a balance, what does the public actually hear? Do they get the real picture sometimes of what's going on in the wider world about wars and famines and the economy and everything? It's a very complex picture.
I can understand that. Even when I was doing, journalism, mostly, sports journalism, not hard news. When you dealt with big corporations, like for instance, ASO, the company that owns the Tour de France, there was always an expectation that you kind of follow the message, and you didn't offend the wrong people. And I understand that. There's a need for that. I'm not being naive. I just think it's much more fun to create, to sit down with a story that people think they know, like with Taking Berlin, and kind of find a way to tell it in a new way that is going to make the reader turn the pages and make them, want to know more about the characters. Maybe do, after they read the book, go on and do some more research on their own.
Yeah, that's so true. And I've learned through my years in journalism and so on, I was naive enough to once believe that, why do all these big companies themselves have researchers and staff and employ these outside agencies to do additional research to what is available in the public domain. And it struck me as that, you really have to dig deep, which kind of takes us to your latest work, Taking Berlin, because you dug deep and you brought a lot of information to light that maybe we didn't previously know. And just going to read this here. You previously co-authored over 10 best-selling killing books with political commentator Bill O'Reilly, who you mentioned earlier. And similar to Taking Paris and the Killing series with Bill, over, I think, 10 or 11 million sales so far. Taking Berlin is a work of historical non-fiction and focused on events and figures from a specific era. The Taking books are based on World War II, obviously, and it opens in the summer of 1944, overlapping some of the time frame of your Taking Paris before the liberation of Paris. So sort of give us a brief overview of it. We'll just talk about the style of it and how you approached kind of each chapter.
Well, going in, I thought that this would be a perfect sequel to Taking Paris. We would pick up August 26th, 1944. Paris has been liberated. And from that point, we would go straight on to Berlin and, the last 9 months of the war. And I wrote that chapter about, the Americans marching into Paris after it's been liberated and literally marching straight through Paris out the other side and beginning the campaign towards Berlin. And then I got stuck. And sometimes as a writer, the hard part about writing a bigger piece, like a book, like anything, like writing anything, but with a book, it's more problematic. You need to know where to get into the story. If you come in too late, you've left out a lot of context, a lot of backstory. If you get in too soon, too early, you got a lot of, fluff, a lot of, time to cover before you get to the meat of the story, which is a problem I'm having with Taking London right now. But that's another thing. But I realized with Taking Berlin, what I needed to do was not start at August 26th. I needed to go back all the way to D-Day and even the run up to D-Day, because D-Day really marks that the Allied advance on Berlin. And so, which, June 6, 1944. So I opened on May 15th, 1944, when the Allies, all the top Allied generals and admirals meet in London with Winston Churchill, with the King of England, with General Bernard Montgomery, the top British Field Marshal, and they're going to unveil the plans for D-Day. And once I got there, then I spent the whole first section of the book explaining, introducing all the characters instead of just telling the story of D-Day, which is a book unto itself, because there's so many different moving parts. I chose to focus on 4 main characters who will be woven in through the rest of the story. Patton, James Gavin, Norman Coda, actually 5, Martha Gellhorn, and General James Gavin. So all those people form the backbone of the rest of the story. And so in setting them up and telling their story, what happened to them on D-Day, and then showing the advance of the American Third Army, towards Paris. That first chapter I wrote about Paris, an August 26, 1944 chapter, it went from chapter 1 to chapter 14. All these other stories needed to be told to set up the rest of the story. And only then once all that was in place, then we could focus on that final push across the Rhine into Berlin.
Yeah, and what I like about it is you write it in the present tense, correct? That's your style. And each chapter has a timestamp and a kind of maybe a political point of view, but a viewpoint, let's say. And the characters become real and vivid, and you feel you're in the middle of this action. But we're not going to pick up a regular history book and read about characters like Martha Gellhorn, and you get into this and uncover some sparkling detail. And she was a war correspondent.
Yeah, and I thought it would be interesting. Like when Taking Paris, we had a woman named Virginia Hall, who was a spy, American-born spy, worked for the British, had one leg, And I found the response to the book was people really liked that the stories are more personal instead of broader,
Hmm.
macro type thing. But also people found it unusual to have a woman in the story. And I didn't, when I did Taking Berlin, I didn't originally mean to have Gellhorn in the story, although I was looking for a woman. Um, but Gellhorn's claim to fame is she was Ernest Hemingway's third wife.
Hmm.
And I had wanted to put Hemingway in the book. He was going to be one of the top 5 characters.
Oh.
And then I found out that he didn't really do a lot. It's like I couldn't tell his story. I mean, he was there at D-Day, but he wasn't there through the rest, the next 9 months. He was doing other things. He kind of left the scene, and I kind of linked up with the idea of Gellhorn just because I read some of her journalism, and then I read about her stowing away on a hospital ship on D-Day so she could actually help with the wounded and see the story for herself. And so, she does. It's weird to have a World War II book where, with 5 balanced characters, one of them is a female war correspondent, but her point of view and she was at so many pivotal places. She was at D-Day. She was at Market Garden. She was down in Italy. She flew on a night flight with a bomber crew over Germany. I just love that perspective. At the end, she's at Dachau when Dachau is liberated. I mean, all these things that we know happened, but to have an individual express what it felt like in her own words, I thought was fascinating.
Yeah, Ernest Hemingway himself had also been a war correspondent in his career.
Yeah, yeah, it was kind of it's weird when you look at Hemingway's career, like starting off, and he was an ambulance driver in World War I, and belatedly kind of you begin writing about World War I just as almost as a memoir. And then when you get to 1944, it's a much older Ernest Hemingway, not an 18-year-old, but all of a sudden a 45-year-old in 1944, who he's famous. He's a little bit grizzled. He drinks too much. If you read his journal, he's having issues. And on top of that, he's fighting with his wife, and he's having an affair with a fourth woman. So he's a very, here's the thing: I could have put Hemingway in there. I'm a big Hemingway fan, but he would have been a distraction because his focus during that point in the war, late 1944, Battle of Bulge time, he was there, but he was much more focused on, finding a new mate, divorcing his third wife, um, kind of running rabble rousing with generals and doing fun things. But it was more like he was more interested in drinking than he was in writing.
Yeah, he's a complex character, and we've all read his novels and so on. Part of me feels that he liked attention and he liked fame. He was larger than life character.
Oh, he was. No doubt about it. I think to his detriment. I think that it's that was a time when the writer as celebrity was much more real than it is today. I mean, right now when you think of a celebrity writer, you maybe think of, I don't know, James Patterson or Stephen
Mm.
King or Salman Rushdie. But back then, at Hemingway, you had Fitzgerald, you had all these other characters, and they were as famous as movie stars. That was a big deal, and he liked that celebrity. He liked that fame. He liked the fact that people, he liked the fact that he was a little bit notorious. And I really don't think that since Hunter S. Thompson died that we've had a writer who really capitalized as much on his great writing skills as well as his lifestyle to affect a celebrity. I mean, if my big thing is going to the local pub and having a couple beers at the end of the day. I think that's much more what your modern writer is like. No one's gonna, nothing flashy about that. Nothing that makes you don't get a bad boy reputation doing that. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And even in the world of journalism, tabloid journalism, all the big columnists who were big celebrities in their day, they were on, they were just consumed people's life. They were fascinated by them. Amazing.
oh yeah, and it's when you think about it, we've come a long way. All of a sudden, you're much more famous if you've got a YouTube channel than if you write a great book. It's funny how that works. I can't think of it. Even James Patterson, I know Jim really well, and he's on Twitter. He does all the social media stuff, but he doesn't have even though he sells millions of books. I think the statistic is like of every 28 to 30 books sold in the English language, one is a James Patterson book, but he still doesn't have the fame and notoriety as most TikTok stars. That's
No,
a different era.
you write with James Patterson too. We shouldn't mention here.
Yeah, I did. We did one book together, and the interesting thing about that book, as pertains to what we're talking about now, is it was the murder of King Tut, and so we were trying to. And he came to me and he said, "I'd like to tell this story in a very fast moving way." And he was suggesting, like, let's keep the chapters brief, cliffhanger endings, a big cinematic opening chapter, and research all the details, make sure no detail is too small. And at the time, I didn't get it. I think that was 2005 or 2006. I didn't understand how you could tell history with short chapters and in kind of a page turning style. I thought history had to be slow and plotting. And in writing that book, and Jim kept challenging me, tighten things up, make it move faster. I found that it was a much more fun way to write. And also, I thought you could put all the same details in there, but if you focused on telling the story more than telling, dry, dusty, boring history, it was a lot more fun to read too. And that was the style I later used when we began doing the Killing series. Bill kind of left me alone for most of the first book to kind of come up with the voice and the style of it. And that's where I dropped in that first person "you are there" feeling, put in the timestamp to use as a guide. Because if you have that chronology at the start of every chapter, even if you rotate characters in and out, the reader can follow it because they're following the timeline. So they'll know that, okay, we're going to lose this character for a couple of chapters, but if we follow the timeline, we know this character is going to pop up again, 4, 5, 6 chapters down the road. And so it was that James Patterson training that led into the style we used on the Killing books. And then, Bill and I, even tightened that structure further. And then when I began doing the Taking series, I used all that, the Patterson, the O'Reilly, and then I breathed just a little bit more of me into it. Bill's not like every time I put something romantic into one of the O'Reilly books or something kind of very poetic, Bill would say, "Okay, that's wonderful, but we need to take it out." And so in this book with Taking Berlin, Taking Paris, I get the chance to keep them in. But then the responsibility is, if you keep moments, those personal moments, the interaction between a soldier and his commanding officer, the interaction between, a journalist and a general, if you do that in a way that isn't just telling story history, you have a responsibility to not let it distract from the story overall.
Right. So if a reader picks up your book, and I recommend they buy it, Taken Berlin, are the facts as we know them? Are they the established facts? Do you embellish anything? Do you change? Do you take any literary license and say, well, that was not exactly how it happened, but we're going to put it in because it makes for a great story?
Oh, if only that were so. No, no, that's the thing, is like, it goes back to the responsibility to the reader. If I'm writing history, and I've never written fiction in my life. So if I'm writing a history book, it's pure nonfiction. And in the facts are the facts. As much as I would like to embellish or guess, until I can nail down a fact as being truthful, I will not put it in the book. It just can't, because once you get, like, I wouldn't say it's like getting caught in a lie, but it kind of is. Once the reader catches you in a lie, once the reader realizes that you put something in there that you made up or you supposed, and that is the biggest error an author can make, is the error of supposition. You lose them. All of a sudden, they start doubting everything you're going to put into the book. Let me give you an example. In the opening, and it sounds petty, but this is the focus on detail. In the opening prologue of Taking Berlin, there's a scene where they're having that meeting I spoke of in London. We have all the admirals and generals, and they're going to show them the plans for D-Day. In describing the doors at the leading into this auditorium, and I describe them, I think, as Gothic, the style. There's Gothic, something else, and pine. And Now the word pine, okay, the pine doors, not a big deal, but at first I thought they were maple, and I was doing some research. Actually, wrote to the school where the this meeting was held, and I was in what it came around to. The doors were not maple, the doors were not oak, which I also thought they might be, but it took me like 4 months to figure out, to nail down the fact that the doors were just very old, 19th century pine doors that were there. But I almost took any type of wood description out of the book just because I didn't want to be wrong. You can't have someone come back to you in 6 months and go, "Oh, I was there, and those were not pine; those were, mahogany."
Mm.
So, and so just those little things. That obsessive focus on detail is 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 a very, very demanding part of writing really fascinating history, but at the same time it has to be done because, like I said, if I start making stuff up, just kind of guess at the type of wood in those doors, then I'm going to start guessing at all these other things down the line. And it's that discipline to the truth that really makes the research fun.
So, which takes us to your research generally. Unlike taking Paris, research for taking Berlin was much different. You had more liberty because we came out of COVID, and you were actually then able to physically travel to see a lot of the places where all this action described in the book unfolded.
Yeah, that was great because when I began writing Taking Paris, I mean, literally start putting words on the page. It was early March, I think, 2020, and my wife and I were going to go to London and Paris on like the second week of March, which is exactly when COVID blew up. So we had to cancel that trip, and thankfully I covered the Tour de France all those years, so I was able to use my notes from all the cities I visited along the way, all the time I'd spent there, to inform a lot of the descriptions. But most of it was just done online, and to me that was necessary, but it just kind of felt a little bit lazy, or I would say half-assed, because it just wasn't how I usually worked. I do like to do a lot of stuff. Like, for instance, with Taking London, I just got to fly in a Spitfire, which was an amazing sensation. But with Taking Berlin, we were able to go all those places, Dachau, Berlin, Operation Market Guard. We actually followed the path of the British Second Army as they pushed through the Dutch countryside, and we went across the bridge at Grave, which the 82nd Airborne held, went to Nijmegen, which was fascinating because that's where a group of American Rangers famously paddled across the river into the teeth of very stiff German resistance, half of them dying or drowning. And then to go to these places now is super fun. And for instance, the place where those guys put the boats in the water is now a CrossFit gym. So
Yeah, I
so
saw that in your back
yeah,
at the end.
yeah,
Extraordinary.
yeah. It's just fun, and
Yeah.
on the way, but we drove from there down to Normandy to look at the Normandy beaches again. And for anybody who's planning on going to Normandy, I highly recommend you go in February instead
Hmm.
of June or July when all the tourists are there, because in February it's wonderful and it's empty.
Yeah.
But we stopped at Dunkirk on the way, just to look at the Dunkirk beaches, which I'd never seen before, and just to get to immerse in all that research, to go to all those places and know what happened in a specific spot. I mean, when we were at Omaha, I went to the exact spot where the Army Rangers led the troops led by Norman Coda off the beach, and now it's a tranquil little quiet
Yeah.
enclave. And back then it was barbed wire and landmines and explosions and German snipers on the hillside. It was just fascinating to go back and be able to see these places and smell the air and describe the scene.
Yeah. And did you get a chance to visit those terrible extermination camps, Dachau, and all those horrible places?
Yeah, I went to Dachau, and I need to go to Ravensbrück simply because I've written about it before and I'm curious. It was the female camp 50 miles north of Berlin. I've never been to Auschwitz, and I do want to go. The thing about the death camps is, and I would caution listeners the same thing, it stays with you. It kind of burns itself into your soul. Um, And when you read about what happened in certain places, and like at Dachau, you go into these rooms where people were tortured and people were hung up by their
Yeah.
their elbows, and people were shot. It's impossible to imagine. At the same time, when you leave, you don't just, it's not like leaving Disneyland where that you leave that experience behind. It burns into you, it stays with you.
Gosh. I remember you saying on the last time I interviewed you, you were describing Paris just prior to, um, the recapture and the liberation, if you will, of Paris, and just prior to the Second World War, how modern in feel and atmosphere it was. Lights on the street, beautiful buildings, a restaurant, a culture, um, movie houses, and all the trappings of wealth on many levels. And then it was invaded, and of course the whole of Europe, or good sections of Europe, were laid bare by bombs and destruction. It's just amazing to contemplate that, how modern man could do that to each other.
It's That's something I'm dealing with right now, is the fact that Winston Churchill talked about before World War II that the biggest difference between World War I and World War II was the fact that there have been so many advances in aviation. So the biggest threat was not going to be men in the trenches. The biggest threat was going to be people able to use those bombers to bomb other cities. So when World War I began, the first thing they did was bomb the Polish city of Wielun, Wielun. Had no military advantage whatsoever. It was just a tiny little village that the Germans dive bombed, and then they leveled Warsaw. And the interesting thing is, because Paris was such a jewel, they didn't bomb Paris. There were very few bombs dropped on Paris at all, but it wasn't carpet bombed like so many other cities. And but ironically, Berlin was just destroyed at the end of the war between the Russians and between bombing and artillery and soldiers, and it was just, by the end of the war, Berlin was just rubble.
Yeah, I know all the veterans of the Second World War. They're up there in years. There's still some of them are alive, thank God, and with us, and we honour them as we should. And there are people who went through the Second World War still alive, obviously, at different. There might be some ones in very up in their 70s or whatever. But did you get a chance to talk to any of those people and get a sense of what they went through, Germans or Allies side, Axis side?
I have in the past, but I didn't specifically for this book, just for the reason you're talking about. Almost everybody in that group they called aging out. Just basically they're at a point where they're dying.
Yeah.
It's real simple. My dad was a Vietnam War pilot, and he's 90. So it's one of those things that most of the veterans of World War II are dead or dying. But no, I didn't have a chance to talk to anybody. I've over the years talked to other veterans who have been there, and then they have informed a lot of more of the curiosity about the narrative. Like they had great stories, and wouldn't it be great to put those stories on paper? But no, sadly, I did not interview a single veteran for this book.
Yeah, it's just a great read, Taking Berlin, your latest. Is there anything you learned from your research and putting the words to paper? Anything you came away with and says just blew your mind that you kind of hadn't realized? Any eureka moment?
Well, there's a lot, but one in particular, it's really off color, but I found that there was a need for, I think it beats within us all. Winston Churchill, George Patton, Robert Boyd Browning, two generals and a prime minister. The first thing they did was, when they set foot on German soil, was to urinate on the soil, and it's such a primal thing. And they, 2 out of 3 did it with photographers standing there, and they were completely unembarrassed to do it. And you learn a lot with any book. You learn tons. You learn about obscure battles. You learn about obscure acts of heroism. But the primal need to literally take a leak on German soil, I found, it's like, where does that come from? I found it very, very comical.
Yeah, and the other thing you do in the book is you describe the ordinariness, if you will, of some of these characters, even though they were high level and famous international figures. They had egos and they had troubles and griefs and emotional issues, just like the rest of us.
You know, about 15 years ago, I was going into a meeting. I was pitching a book idea to a really, really powerful guy, big, really high up in the entertainment world. And I was with a buddy of mine who was also representing a project of his own. And he asked me why I was so nervous. And I said, well, this guy's done this and this and this, he's really powerful. And my friend said something I've never forgotten. He goes, Marty, he's just a guy. And when you break it down like that, when you take any male or female, no matter how wealthy or powerful or whatever, and you just say at the end of the day, they're just a human being. They do all the same stuff every day that we all do. They have the same doubts and fears and hopes. It makes it easier to approach a character. So, you take Patton, for instance, this mercurial general. He had, just a genius on the battlefield, but he was also, the ultimate authority figure for a lot of the soldiers during World War II. If you read his journals, though, he has moments of sadness and depression. He misses his wife. He's furious at moments. And when you read that, you don't feel like you're reading the words of some imperial general who has, all-consuming power. You feel like they're reading the words of just a guy who's trying to figure out how to get through the next obstacle and make great things happen. And once you do that, it really makes it easier to write about them, because you stop putting them up on a pedestal and you bring them down right where they should be.
I heard somebody once say, never meet your heroes, because it'll change your entire perception of them. We all have these heroes in our life and idols, I guess, on some level. You meet them, you realize how ordinary they are when you get to know them.
It's a funny story. I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan. I have been for 40 years, been to hundreds of concerts. And he did a book tour a few years ago where if you came and bought a book, and he appeared at different places around the country, you could get a picture taken with Bruce. And I thought, man, that's really cool. I'm going to drive to LA. I'm going to do that. And at some point I thought, I don't want that. He might say something that might rub me the wrong way. Something might happen that might take away this connection we've had through his music all over the years. Like you said, at the end of the day, I just thought, let's make the connection through the music instead of getting a picture taken together.
So Taking Berlin is your latest, and you have another book in the works. We'll talk about that real quickly in a moment. How long did it take you to write this book?
That's 7 months.
7 months, and constant. It's intense, right? It's an intense process.
It's a very intense process. In the case of Taking Berlin, Bill and I were finishing up the Killing the Legends, which was the last Killing book. They overlapped for a bit, so I had moments where I would write 2,000 words of Taking Berlin. I would take a little break, come back and write 1,000 words of Taking the Legends, and then I'd go coach in the afternoon, and that was like a 6-week overlap, and that was horrible. So, but like I said, the funny thing is, I think just that focus, because the quality of both books could not suffer despite the fact that I was doing two at the same time. And I think that intense focus actually informed the narrative, because I find looking at Taking Berlin, it's a much more detailed, much more taut, much more I think it's a better book than Taking Paris, and I love Taking Paris, but I feel like Berlin is better because I just had this hyper focus with it.
Yeah, well, I have a copy here beside me, and I'm delighted I've had a chance to read it. You mentioned actually you were coaching, you were working on these two projects, and you were coaching. That's what I'm saying. At the beginning, you're an energetic, and maybe you are my hero. Maybe we should never meet in person.
No, anytime. Let's get together.
And speaking of Bill O'Reilly and your collaborations, so Killing the Legends is the latest. He was on radio just before we started this recording, and that's a good read, because we won't get into it. We don't have enough time, but it talks about Muhammad Ali, Elvis Presley, and John Lennon. And I learned from it that John Lennon, according to Bill on the radio, was a heroin addict by 1967.
Yeah, he picked up a little bit of a heroin problem. He was not a junkie. We always think of people, injecting and then falling asleep. He he snorted heroin, which is a little bit different. And you know, if you kind of go around and poke around the internet, it's not exactly a secret, but you know, and because his former dealer is you know, we can mention him by name, but it's a little bit of surprise because for the Beatles, you know, for all the talk you would hear, you know, if you go back through the history about, you know, smoking marijuana and all the enlightenment that hallucinogenics brought forth, to the Beatles, taking heroin was kind of crossing a line. It was like you were saying, going over to the dark side. It was kind of like one drug that you just didn't do. So, you know, John never really, you know, became one of those people who was a daily user, but at the same time, he did partake.
Yeah, yeah, great read, and Ali, and then we have Elvis. So you know, just sort of interesting depth of information. So Taking Berlin is the latest, and then you're working on, I guess, sequel, or Taking London is the next up. And when will we expect that out on the bookshelves, Martin?
I'm hoping this time next year. They're talking about pushing it until 2024, but I mean, I'm going to be done in just about 3 or 4 weeks. So I hate to have it languish that long, but we'll see. But it, again, you know, and I wanted to, and I, instead of telling, I should have told the whole story of the war. You know, Taking London should have come first. Then we should have done Taking Paris, then Taking Berlin. That's chronologically, but we're kind of messing up the chronology because, and here's why. There was something that at the end of Taking Berlin, Churchill does that epic speech in Fulton, Missouri, where it's called the Iron Curtain speech, where he talks about, you know, the Soviet threat and the fact that the Soviet Union is putting an iron curtain across Europe that is dividing the world, dividing our ideology, and setting the stakes for the next great war. But he says, you know, before this war, before World War II, I predicted it, and nobody would listen to me. So he said, you know, listen to me now. And so I went back to all the stuff Churchill had said in the years leading up to World War II. You know, beginning in the early 1930s, he warned the world about Hitler. He warned the world about the Nazi threat in a time when everybody thought the Nazis were nice guys. The Nazis were kind of in fashion in the early 1930s because everybody favored the Nazis over the communists.
Yeah.
And then, you know, Hitler was kind of exiled. He became a Jeremiah, kind of this voice crying in the wilderness, trying to warn people about World War II. So when it finally happened, you know, it was like prophecy was, and I wanted to tell that story a little bit just because I didn't know that part of the story very well, and I wanted to spend some time with it. And it's been a great learning experience to go back. And then, of course, you got to put the philosophy in there, but then you got to find the action. So, you know, we get to know the Spitfire pilots. We get to know some of the atrocities the Germans are committing with those bombings we talked about. So, and then that puts us into the Battle of Britain.
Wow. So anyway, we've a lot to look forward to, and I'm going to have you back when you when that's released, Taking London, and any other works you put out there. And in the meantime, I'm sure you'll have time out to relax, enjoy Christmas holidays, and do all the celebrations, because I'm sure you would appreciate. Although you do this, well, we're in the middle of winter now, so there's no field and track, right? Or maybe you go indoors.
We just got done with cross country last Saturday. I'm going to take 5 weeks. I give the kids 5 weeks between seasons to kind of get their minds together, let their bodies rest. We'll start track again on January 4th.
Okay.
And but in the meantime, and then my wife and I are going to London next week. I can do a little bit more research. We're going to spend a week there. And, you know, London at Christmas time is wonderful. And then I'll write while I'm there, you know, put some of the new information into the book. And then I write 5 days a week, even during the holidays. It's kind of like breathing. I mean, if it's something that you do it every day. And I love it. I mean, it's like, why wouldn't I go? My office is in my garage. So all I do is I walk 30 steps and I'm sitting in front of my computer. So it's great.
Oh, that's great. Marty Dugard, thank you for being on my show. Good luck with your next book, and enjoy the visit to London, and we'll catch up again soon.
Yeah, I look forward to it. This has been fantastic. All right.
Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you. I'm glad